Hello, everybody. Welcome to Thru Port Collective. This is three guys getting together and discussing their life's passions involving music and studio recording and synthesizers, electronic music, and really even beyond that. All things music related and definitely synthesizer specific a lot. We have here Chris Cynthia, and we have Mark.
Hello.
Hello, Chris. And we have Marshall Arnold.
Howdy.
And I've got some kind of kickback now. What is that?
Are you getting an echo again?
Yeah, hang on. It's beyond an echo. It's way. Oh, there. That it's gone now. Nope, there it is. It's back.
It's back.
It's back, and it's about 20 seconds behind or something.
Check for a web browser, the YouTube page open.
Yeah, I'm just going to get rid of that.
So with the pop-out chat, you can have that going, but I always get rid of the actual streaming page.
I believe that was my issue. Sorry about that.
Well, that's what I did last week. So,
welcome, to, Marshall. When you intro the show next week, be sure to have that same problem. So it
Sure.
Yeah. Otherwise, I feel very bad.
So we're consistent. Welcome all these people in the chat. I definitely see some familiar names here, which is really cool. Thanks, guys, for joining us. I know some of you are early in the morning at this time. 8 p.m. for me here, 9 p.m. for Marshall, and I guess 6 p.m. for Chris. So, yeah, it's cool to see y'all, as they say. And, we just kind of want to discuss a few things today. I think songwriting is generally our topic to center around, but we'll probably morph that into other things as we do, as is our nature.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things that I was thinking about with this, because songwriting is, you would think, it's like, well, this is one of the most important things that we could talk about, but why is it not talked about very much in all the shows that we watch? Like, I don't see it really, that process given much importance in this. I'm just kind of curious of what you guys think that is. Like, why is that not a more important thing?
I don't think that it's not important. It's just sometimes it can be hard to quantify, like your thought process, and the way, at least for me, like I find it fascinating to hear about other people's process and how they go about doing things. But sometimes maybe it's not the most interesting thing to talk about. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing that you don't see too much conversation about that, at least on some of these shows. But I don't know. What do you think, Tim?
I definitely think it's hard to break it out sometimes. That's a hard thing to explain to someone. Really, it's probably one of the more abstract processes that we deal with. Is where does the creativity come from, and how do we direct it and harness it? That's a pretty interesting thing that everyone would have different, would go about differently, rather than maybe just talking about features on a synth that they would like to see, which is something very concrete. So, I think that's probably one of the reasons some people don't tackle it. They may not have even, I don't know, in some cases, I don't think it doesn't maybe even matter to them what their process is. They're just doing it and enjoying themselves.
Yeah.
So for me, though, it's very interesting, and I've always been interested in other people's processes about writing, and like, how did they get to that kind of moment, and what can I learn from this person? So I think it's a fascinating topic. We hope that our small but mighty audience agrees. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, it's one of the topics that I've been most interested, I think, in music. And when I got into music pretty deep, and like especially in my teen years, like I during that time is like when I read, band biographies or artist biographies to kind of find out what their lives were like, because in the books you don't really get to find out too much about, some of the more finer technical aspects of recording or anything like that, but you kind of get an idea of what went on. But I think that kind of stuff doesn't really interest me so much anymore. There's very few people that I would really care to get into the history with so much. But the songwriting process, like if I watch a documentary now, it's usually if it's going to be covering, a particular album, how it came about. I've listened to a couple recently that were really interesting. So one was with there was a Australian band, Silverchair, and they kind of started out in the very grunge era, but they kind of shifted into the early 2000s and went, just real, very influenced by, say, like Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys and things like that. So, and it got very orchestral, and the songwriting process or how it happened changed a lot. And so I had ended up watching a documentary on the making of their album Diorama, and I thought that was fascinating. And then another recent one that was maybe not as much about writing, but the process of musicians coming together to make songs. And there was about it was an hour and a half or something interview with Nigel, the engineer producer for Radiohead, and it was documenting the creative process of OK Computer, which is a phenomenal album. And so it was kind of interesting as he talked about it, not being a member of the band, but being somebody that was very integral in that whole process as he looked on it to see how these guys function and how it came together. I was really quite, I very much enjoyed that. But I think, to get back to the point of like, why isn't this talked about more? I think what you said, Tim, is probably true. It's like, it's a lot easier to just talk about the features of gear because it's very sensory. It doesn't require a lot of deeper and abstract thought in the process. And perhaps one of the benefits about that is if you don't like something, you go, well, that gear is terrible for these reasons. Instead of when it comes to the songwriting process, when the song comes out bad, you're like, well, can't blame my gear for that.
Yes.
It's like there's too much accountability in it.
Yes, it's true. But no, that's when you do blame your gear, right? Yeah, it's like no one liked my song. It's just because the gear I used. That's what it is.
Yeah.
I used to think that sometimes that
Seriously, yeah.
Early on, before I had really any gear, or, I was using mostly software. But thinking, oh man, if I had some of these synthesizers, like I could sound like my heroes, you know what I mean? But then I ran across a guy, I can't remember who it was. It was during the MySpace days, like that's how long ago this was. But I ran across this guy who had just a studio full of gear, just like this, you know what I mean? Fancy gear, nice stuff. And I listened to his music and it was garbage. And I was like,
Yeah.
well, okay, so if this guy has all this expensive stuff and he sounds not very good, that's interesting to me. Like I hadn't even considered the fact that, you can buy all the toys you want, but if you don't really know what you're doing, you might still not make any progress. So it kind of made me feel a little better, actually, in the way that getting started and trying to teach myself this stuff, I was actually doing really well considering what I was using. Mm-hmm. So I felt confident, like, get some gear and hopefully improve some of the soundscapes that I was able to create. You know what I mean? But
yeah. I think from the inverse of that is like studying some of these bands and how they recorded some of the very classic albums, and especially going back into some of the classic 60s albums where they're using 4-track or 8-track recordings, and they've got one compressor in the studio. They've got like treble and bass on the board EQ, and like not much else to work with. Or the Beatles mixing on a single speaker in the studio room there. Then it helps to see like, man, they made such epic music with so few things. Some of the things did sound good, and it was a great, Abbey Road's a great studio, so there's no problems there. But at the same time, with such limited things, like they were just pumping out such amazing albums. So yeah, definitely you can see it from both sides. The gear doesn't, if the artist isn't up to the task, the gear's not going to help you anymore. And if you are
Right.
a fantastic artist, the gear can't get you down if you don't have much.
Or you're just somebody like Michael Jackson, who I don't think he could really play anything, but he would record all of his rhythms and melodies onto tape and then like hand them off to the producers, and they would go and make all the magic, so to speak, based on what he gave them. So if you're Michael Jackson, I guess you don't need to worry about it.
Yeah, all you need is Quincy Jones and Toto and
yeah.
It's
maybe
great.
later on in his career, maybe he did some more stuff. But I just remember even seeing like that. There was that lady who accused him of like stealing Billie Jean or something. And you see in the deposition, like he's like giving them examples of how he did his stuff, and then provided like evidence. It's really fascinating, that whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a cool process. I mean, that means you don't really have to have control of an instrument. You just have to have the ideas, and then someone that can get them out for you, right? And get them down for you in some way. And that's where like where an instrument does make such a difference is just an inspiration. Pure inspiration sometimes comes right out of a sound. It's if you're sitting there just goofing around with a sound. This has happened to me so many times, and I know I'm not alone with this. If I'm just sitting there goofing around with a sound and I'm tweaking on it, and just starting to play a couple of things, all of a sudden it just starts kind of pushing me in a direction. I can kind of start to hear it go, oh wait, it would do this cool right now.
Yeah.
So that's definitely in the synth world for me. Chris, I bet like guitar and with pedals and whatnot, it's the same thing. You're going to write through what that sound sort of suggests.
Yeah, well, that's a an interesting thing, that both the sonics of something and also perhaps the physicality of the instrument that you're using and the tone it produces is going to kind of bring out something different. And that definitely, I noticed that perhaps a bit more with writing on guitar versus writing with synth, that the things that are going to come out of something like my Gretsch is going to be, cleaner, chimier, maybe more classic or R&B sounding. And then, you have something else that's, like my 7-string, super shredder here, like probably not that kind of stuff, like when you sit down, your mind is already kind of pushing a direction of, that's not the guitar that you make such and such a music with. Not that it can't, it sure can, but it's just kind of funny how sometimes that sound or that instrument will, again, just push you. And sometimes that will help in the fact of like when you want to get into the mood of something, like, I'd like to write a song. Okay, I'm thinking, more R&B than metal. Okay, so I'm gonna start over in this direction with these instruments, perhaps.
Yeah. Find the right casting.
Yeah.
For the vibe, for the instruments, the right casting. Well, should we just like go around the horn here and kind of describe more specifically what each of our processes is? Now we've sort of laid down some general groundwork. Like Marshall, do you want to tell us, like, kind of walk us through building a track for you, writing a track?
Yeah, so most of the time I don't always have an idea, but sometimes I will. Sometimes when I'm messing around, like I'll come up with melodies or chord progressions and I'm like, I need to remember that because I want to make something with that. But not always. Sometimes I'll sit down and I'll just start working on stuff. And I'll usually start with the percussion and a bass line to kind of get a groove going, almost like how we did with our collaborative track. Like that's kind of normally, if I don't have anything specific, that's usually how I'll start. And then I kind of build what I call the meat and potatoes of the track. So the main portion of the song, a couple of measures is what I tend to focus on first to get an idea of like what I want to end up at, so to speak, I guess. And then I'll kind of, bring elements in and out from there. And there was an interesting question on the Synth Show Facebook group. I think Jamie asked, what do you struggle with in terms of music production? And my thing is like, when I get that meat and potatoes part done and I'm kind of get the basics and get the intro going, get built up into that main part, the hardest part for me is having to go through and trying to figure out how am I going to change this up and make it interesting so somebody can listen to something for more than, like a minute and a half or something. So I tend to spend a lot of time on that section trying to figure out, am I going to do a key change? Like, how am I going to do this breakdown? Like, how do I want to keep it interesting after that main part, and then figure out how to kind of bring it all back together. Because I like to take elements from the beginning of the song, the main part, and I'll try and add some more stuff in the breakdown and try and bring it all kind of together at the end. So that tends to be my thing. And Tim, you made a very interesting point that I agree with 100%. Sometimes when you're working on stuff, the track will kind of tell you like what it needs, if that makes any sense to you guys. Mm-hmm. Like you'll be listening to your work and you'll be like, man, this thing like would just really sound great with like a really cool, pad or a sweep or something. You know what I mean? Like it'll kind of tell you like, it needs this, and then you'll kind of add it. Does that make sense?
Definitely. That's like there's a writer part or an artist part, let's call it, inside of me, and then there's an editor. There's an editor and a producer kind of head, and it's usually those two heads that are in there. And I let one come in, and do its thing, and I try to keep that editor head kind of restrained, frankly. But sometimes that's exactly what's needed, because if the track is telling you to do something, then that editor can come in and go, you sit back and listen to it from that perspective and go, right. Well, it just needs kick drum doing this now, and it needs a little line right here.
Yeah.
Or it needs to get fat and really big right here, or whatever. That's that moment where you break through and go, now we have a track.
Yes. And that's the best part for me, when you get when it all kind of falls into place and you're like, yeah, I dig it. There's that point where you're like, I don't know if you guys do this sometimes. So like I'll start working on something and I'll abandon it because I either get stuck or like I don't know what to do, or I'm just not liking where it's going. So when I do have a successful turn that corner, so to speak, that's the best part for me.
That's kind of, that's almost the eureka moment, isn't it? It's like, there it is.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Chris?
What is, before I go, like, we're very good at hitting the kind of abstract on it, but maybe if we could also go through like the very literal sensory of the experience. So Marshall, like, tell us about what that looks like in you. Is this the room that you're recording in? Are you just flipping on a synth, or you're pulling up your DAW, like all those bits? Like, how does that process begin for you?
That would be cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll come in and I'll sit down and sometimes it really depends, like, because it can change. Like, I've got so much gear to choose from. Sometimes that gets a little difficult unless I'm already focused on a synth. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll start in software, actually, and I'll start with a plugin or a couple plugins and kind of build from there. And sometimes I'll leave them. Sometimes I'll switch them out for actual hardware. Sometimes, sometimes not. But so in here, this is where I tend to produce most of the stuff that I release on my label. And then in the other room, that's where I'm working on this whole live performance type thing. Most of the stuff that I've written in the past, I could probably port into that setup and try and do some stuff with that. And I may do that, but I'm gonna try and kind of start from scratch with that whole setup in there because it's completely different. Other than using Ableton, as I use Ableton basically as an audio mixer and effects processor in that live room, and then most of the sequencing though is handled by that Blue Arp and just doing it live. You know what I mean? So it's a whole different way to think. Between it's like two separate worlds kind of thing. But what I'd like to do is get really good at the live stuff and then bring those tracks back in here and like finish them up and release those too, so but in terms of like how do I start normally, usually I come in and unless I'm already like itching to play like the Mode 1, or maybe I'm like, oh man, I haven't touched that V-Synth GT in a while, let me mess around with that. And it can just, sometimes it'll just be messing around, and sometimes I'll start actually making a track with stuff. So it just kind of depends.
Are you using Ableton in your writing room?
Yeah, I use Ableton in both. Yeah.
And are you beginning with like a template? I've never used Ableton, so
Nope.
my reference is Logic and things like that. But you
I
just
start
popping
from
it open.
Yeah, I start with nothing. I don't have a template that I work from. I used to use templates in Pro Tools when I use Pro Tools a lot more, just because there's certain things you're going to use that makes it a little easier that way. But with Ableton, I don't seem to feel like I need to do that, if that makes any sense. I don't know why, but yeah, I have used templates in the past, but I don't really use those anymore.
Yeah, I kind of feel like Pro Tools sort of wants you to do it that way, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of a weird thing, but yeah.
Well, so you get a groove going, you get some sauce happening, and then you're looking for what happened. What are you doing next?
So, like I said, like I'll try and build the main part of the song that I want to build up to, because the type of music I create tends to be, you want it to build. It's a progressive movement from minimal into just a big explosion of sound is kind of how I like to do things, and then bring it down, change it up a little bit, and then bring it all together at the end is kind of how I like to build my tracks usually. So depending on how the bass line's going and some of the elements that are in there, I'll start working on either just atmosphere, or I'll start thinking like, okay, what kind of melodies do I want in this? Is there something that kind of is going to react to the bass line cool? Do I want to follow the bass line? It's just one of those things where you're just kind of messing around to see if you can come up with something cool. There are times though, like where I'll be practicing, especially in the live room. I find this more common in there when I'm messing with the gear in there. I'll start messing around because I can have a setup that runs that's very simple and start kind of bouncing ideas that way. It's like a whole different process that I use in there than in here, which is interesting, but the results tend to be different at the same time. So in there, I tend to, I'll get some very basic arpeggios going, and then maybe I'll be able to play some chords with my right hand, and I'll start working with just some basic rhythms, and then chord progressions with the other hand. And that's like in there, that tends to be like, I'll be like, oh, this is a cool little melody that I came up with, and but I don't do that as much in here, which is weird. So
what's your melody writing process in this room? I mean, like we were just talking about Michael Jackson. Are you like dreaming it up in your head? Are you playing around on the keyboard, or using some sort of random sequencer to kind of pull out interesting things, or how do you go about it?
I'll either have something in my brain that I'll work out on the keys here, or it's something that I came up with randomly out there usually. But there are times where like I don't have any idea of what I'm going to do, and I just kind of start doing stuff. And that tends to be how it is in here, is more like when I sit down to work in here, most of the time I don't really have an idea of what I'm going to do at all. And as the track starts coming together, I come up with things along the way. And I know that there's guys who will sit there and they will spend hours doing sound design and all that kind of stuff. I don't tend to do that ahead of time. It's very rare that I'll pull from a preset list of sounds that I've made or whatever. Most of the times for me, I'll craft sounds as I need them with whatever I'm working on, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But at the same time, some people think that when you get in the flow, if you're having to stop and do more technical stuff like, oh, I need to design this pad or this lead that I want, that I think will go good here, as opposed to having like a whole set of presets that you've either purchased or made yourself. Sometimes I'll go through, if I have some presets, or there's some of these synths have really good presets, and those will help inspire as well. But maybe they need to be tweaked a little bit here or there or whatever. And some people don't like having to stop the process of writing the composition to do that, but I don't really have a problem with that. So I will sometimes stop halfway through a track and start working on some sound design to fit whatever I'm trying to do.
And that's one of the nice things you had brought it before too. Like you may start with one synth, and then as the process continues, you go, well, maybe that's not the right one, and then you can spend some time and with having a DAW, then maybe you have all the MIDI, you've recorded the part already, and so it's just a matter of, again, like you said, finding the right preset or doing the sound design.
And that's the other thing. I don't do stuff with audio very often until the very end. I will sequence everything in MIDI first. And so that's one of the things I really liked about Pro Tools, because they have little sections under the channels you could write notes in. I could say vsynth, this patch, whatever. Or if there's any specific settings, I can write little notes in the channel strip for that. I don't think you can do that in Ableton. I wish they would add that, because sometimes, you'll put a track away for a while that you haven't touched, and you bring it back and be like, oh man, I forgot what patch I was using. I forgot. Like you kind of remember, but you know what I mean? Depends on how long ago it was. But when I get to the point to where like I'm happy with stuff, that's when I'll start recording stems from the instruments and then try and finalize the mix at that point. Because I'm always afraid like, oh, I'm not going to like something and I want to change it. And it's a lot more difficult to do once you commit, at least in my brain anyways. Once I commit to like, put like actual capturing the audio and kind of getting rid of the MIDI portion, I don't usually do that till the very, very end. Like once everything's almost done, basically.
Yeah. I was going to ask you at what point do you decide to start committing the audio, the MIDI to audio and whatnot? So at the very end, and then you're just in mix mode at that point.
Yep. Then once I've recorded all the stems for all the instruments, then I'm in mix mode. And sometimes that can take a long time as well, because you'll get an idea, like, especially you've been working on the same set in the same room. Like, you got to know your room. Like, it's really important, at least for me anyways, because if you're not used to where you're mixing in, or you're not comfortable with things, it can be difficult to mix correctly, if that makes any sense. And most of us, we don't have $1 million studios with all the acoustic treatment and all this and stuff. So, but what I found is, especially working on these M-Audio BX8As, I've had these since 2006 maybe. I've had these almost the whole time, the same exact speakers. And even though they're not the highest end things, the most professional things, I know them extremely well, and I can use reference tracks and figure out like usually how to mix appropriately, and then being able to play out on other systems, either the home theater and the living room, the car, and the phone, all of them. Like I'll test on all of them and then reference based on those different systems as well. And sometimes it'll take a few tries going back and forth between that, sometimes days, of going in and mixing and listening and then referencing and going back. And that part can take a while too, actually. But that's kind of a whole, that's more like the mixing side, right?
The art form of mixing.
Yeah, which is a whole other ball game,
Yes,
there are many rabbit holes to go down that we will.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Well,
Well,
that's cool. I had a question too. Just one more thing, Marshall.
Yeah.
Like tempo wise, I
Hmm.
have I have a lot of questions actually. But do you find yourself kind of existing mostly in a certain tempo range? Like,
Depends on what I'm doing. Like, if I'm doing trance or techno, it's like 140 plus usually. If I'm doing house, I'll slow it down, like 128, 125 to 128. And sometimes even that, like I'll feel like sometimes I'll work on stuff and I'll be like, I don't know why, but this just sounds super slow to me.
mm,
And then even other stuff that is at the same tempo, and you listen to it, and for some reason, like it just sounds faster. You know what I mean? It sounds
mm.
sometimes like I'll get into a situation where I feel like my track is just dragging its ass, and I don't know why that is sometimes. But and those are usually my least favorite tracks. Like when they feel like that, when I feel like they're dragging, it's almost like they get boring. You know what I mean? Like,
I do.
yeah.
I mean, and so do you start pushing up the BPM to see where how far you can push it to maybe get a little more excitement?
No, usually I'll just start over.
Oh, okay. That's
Yeah. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, usually I'll just start over. Like if I that's one of that's more like a situation where I'm like, I'm not feeling this, I'm gonna shelve this, maybe I'll come back to it later, you know.
Well,
So,
that's yeah.
just out of curiosity, so for the trance and techno side of things,
Mhm.
so when I hear the word dragging, just thinking about playing with bands, it's like, okay, yeah, this is a conversation that I have with like the drummer and bassist and rhythm guitarist, and like how the feel of the song is as a drummer pushing or pulling and making sure that we're all in that right part of the groove. Is that something that ever happens in this kind of electronic music, or is it always just strictly on the grid?
Well, so the problem is with with electronic music, if everything is synchronized but then something is a little off here or there, it stands out like a sore thumb, or it can. So
Mm-hmm.
choosing how to implement that to where you get more kind of the feels, like an organic kind of feel instead of a machine, that can be tough because you don't want it to stand out like a sore thumb either. You know what I mean? It's got to fit all together at the same time. And what I've found, at least more recently, is like using a little more swing on my percussion
Mm-hmm.
helps definitely kind of liven things up a little bit more. Um, but yeah, it's hard because, and I think that's kind of what I'm talking about. Like sometimes those tracks that I feel are dragging ass too much, they're really like they're too machine sounding.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I think.
Interesting.
I found there was I played with some I guess it had been like pro gospel musicians, like crazy, like think funk and R&B and whatever that kind of stuff is. And it was such a weird experience. It really threw me off as far as feel goes, because I came from, rock and blues and metal, and playing to that stuff where you would oftentimes be sitting back and like you didn't want to push the beat so much, but they were all completely opposite, and everything was really rushed, and I was really having a hard time with it for a little bit for these gigs. It's like, man, I got to think about this in a whole different way as far as how the feel of the song is. Like, same tempos and stuff, although they tend to do like faster tempo stuff, but that was like a really trippy thing for me. And then when we'd be doing stuff that was a little bit more rock based, they would have the problem with. I said, no, you're pushing too hard on it. Like it's gotta sit back and fall back behind the beat a little bit. I just kind of
Like
was
delay
curious
the
about
bass
that.
slightly kind of thing. Is that what
What's
you mean?
that?
like you're delaying the bass line a little bit behind the percussion, like
Yeah, like where everything
tempo line.
will yeah, kind of
Yeah,
where it
yeah,
sits against the strict meter of it.
yeah, yeah.
Not the
That's
variation of it, like not tempo variation, but the
okay.
just actually where the hits happen. Like, I mean, they always talk about like the
Well, yeah,
Lindrum
yeah, yeah.
thing.
I
That
see
would be kind of an
what you're saying.
extreme example of it, but
Yeah.
yeah.
There are cases where I've run into that though, and it's usually when I have a situation where my kick is interfering too much with the low end and the bass, and
Uh-huh.
so a lot of times I'll sidechain that out. But sometimes it's not enough or it doesn't feel right, and so you do have to end up kind of scooting your bass notes a little bit off the grid, so to speak,
Hmm.
or changing up the rhythm in the melody that you're playing, if that makes sense too. Because
Yeah.
sometimes you get a real boring bass melody and it just sucks, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. Be willing to change the part. Yeah,
Yeah.
take a knife to it, and maybe it's fewer notes or something, or just rhythmically shifting them a little bit where it's off the kick. Yeah.
Yep. Or using that swing even on a bass
Yeah.
line can help liven things up too a little bit.
I think that's where having the two people in your head that you're talking about, Tim, where if you can separate yourself from the performance of it, then you can allow the producer, the editor, to kind of step in and say, yeah, maybe that's not what we need here. So can you do it again, please?
Yeah.
And,
That's
and you're
it.
like,
That's
and then of course you're like, damn,
yeah.
this
Get out of my
guy.
brain. Yeah. That's it. That's I got
But at
that's
least they're all in the same head, because when you have to sit your bass player down and tell him, "Hey, bro, you're just not cutting the mustard here."
right. How come you're not hearing this just how I hear
Yeah, how come your ears don't work like mine, buddy? Yeah, that's a little more of a difficult conversation sometimes.
it?
And I have, other than our collab, like I haven't really worked with too many other people on stuff. So, and I think that's part of the reason why, for
Mhm.
me, anyways. Like, it's hard to communicate to somebody exactly what you want. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, if you're fighting with your own brain, you can do that,
You can do that.
and no one's feeling they're going to get hurt. So,
Well, what's average, time that it takes you, Marshall,
mm,
if there is such a thing,
yeah,
to write and finish a track?
it can be hours and hours. Sometimes, like especially early on, because sometimes like you'll hyper focus on stuff sometimes, but I don't know. I'd say 20 to 30 hours probably
To do a track?
to fit from zero to it's done. Like, and I'm
Mhm.
ready to release it. Yeah, about 20 to 30 hours probably. Some are faster than others. Some are slower, but
Right.
yeah.
I wonder how anyone in the chat room can like comment on that, or Chris, like what, like, because for me it just varies. Sometimes they roll out pretty quick, but sometimes you can sit there and fuss for a long time, or it's just being difficult. Sometimes
Mhm.
things are just being difficult. And you have to
Yeah,
keep
that's part
working
of
on
it. But
it.
like again, because since most of the time, like I don't sit down like I got this idea and I'm just going to work on this idea. Most of the time,
Right,
I don't have any idea what I'm going to do at all.
right.
So just
Gotcha.
develop it, because I'm kind of doing everything all at once. I'm coming up with the composition, I'm coming up with the sound design, and then once I've got those ideas kind of dialed in and I'm happy with where it's going and I want to continue, then I've got the challenge of how do I keep it interesting. Then once you've got that all figured out and the composition's completely done and your sound design's done and you're happy with stuff, then you got to go through the whole mixing process, which for me it's a lot of A-Bing, a lot of reference tracks. It's just takes a long time, for me anyway. Most of the time, from start to finish, it's extremely rare that I'm gonna like finish in just a handful of hours everything. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Oh,
well,
okay.
that's really revealing about, though, you're saying kind of how that first part comes together, because it's all kind of happening at once,
At once, yeah.
until you get it at least to a point, and then you're able to sort of do more of a pick and choose what I do next thing. But at first,
Yeah.
it's just
More
kind of this
spontaneous.
wild thing you're trying to wrangle.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've heard some people that freaks them out doing that. They look at a blank dot and they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And I've never really had a problem with that. I don't have a phobia with any of that. Like I start from nothing and just start working until I find something cool. And to me, it's about the cool factor. Like, do I think this sounds cool?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's one of the things that really drew me into the genre that I like to create for. Is it sounds cool to me. Like I want to make cool stuff that sounds cool.
Yeah. You're the arbiter of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is this cool or not? Yeah. Well, that's up
cool?
to me.
Do I think it's cool?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you gotta like it, or else it's just miserable to do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And hopefully the stuff I like, other people will like too. But if they don't, at least I like it, and I spent time on it, and I'm happy with it.
We got a Star Trek reference here from Paul. Just yell computer into the mouse.
Oh yeah, have a Scotty.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing that I find interesting now is now a lot of manufacturers are coming out with these like AI things that like does everything. I'm like, if you're not the one coming up with most of the stuff, is it even yours then? Like I find that I don't like that. I don't like that whole trend. I'm not a fan of machines doing everything for you or doing it all on their own. Mm-hmm. Like you can come up like if there's elements of that and you're getting like, and you're going to use part of that, but like I just don't like the idea of the machines doing everything for you. Like then where's the creativity there? I mean,
yeah, there's some parts which I really appreciate about that. It's that the place that I will use, whatever it is, quasi AI is for drum stuff, because that slows me down so much. I just want to complete more songs and work on it. And if I'm working here at home and I'm not working with a drummer, that's the part that I tend to dread. And so using some of the tools that'll help you find the right beat. Now the thing is, like I've got a kit, and my wife has been a drummer for a lot of years, but she doesn't play much anymore. She just doesn't have the time for it, and so it's not like I would ask her to come in like, hey, can you record this drum part for me? Like, no, I can play drums, but I'm so out of practice. Like I learned most of the drum stuff I did because I needed to be a band director and I needed to direct other people, and like for arranging songs, like here's how, like, okay, what if, to know what tools are available, that helps. Like I know what a bassist can do and a keyboardist and a drummer can do. And I could play, simple stuff. That's not a problem on the drums, but some of the stuff that I'd write, there's no way I could actually play it. And that's one of the places that I kind of appreciate the speed that it brings. And there's usually always some monkeying around with it. Like, okay, well, this is kind of what I want, but now I can go in and edit a few of these parts and make it a little more personalized to that.
Let me ask you, so are you using something that kind of generates random patterns for you? And then you mess around with it from there?
No, not so. For instance, if I'm, starting, it depends on where you're starting the song from. So, for instance, if I've worked something out on the guitar or the keyboard or something, I'm like, yeah, this is going to have this rhythm and these are the chords and whatnot, and then to go and like, so I use Easy Drummer and Logic Drummer. I don't use Logic Drummer as much for the sounds, but I'll use it for part creation, or at least to get me going on something, because it has kind of an intelligent thing. So like if you say record a guitar part to a click track, and if I've got the basics of the song worked out, like intro, verse, chorus, bridge, whatever, I can record those in, and then it will just generate right away a drum beat. And then you can have it, follow a particular instrument like the rhythm guitar or something. And then you've got some means to work out the style. So they have virtual they've got it's a cute little system, I guess you'd say.
Yeah,
They're
that's
like, I'm
interesting.
I'm going to use classic rock drummer Kyle, or maybe I'm going to use
Oh
hip
yeah.
hop drummer,
Huh.
so and so, and that kind of thing. And so,
I guess I'm confused on how it comes up with the
well,
pattern.
yeah, so it would be checking the transients of your track, and then creating it's different algorithms will be influenced by, again, styles of music. So
Interesting.
if
Is it any good?
it's decent, yeah, it's not
Huh.
bad. I mean, I will always take a good real drummer, but it's better than a bad real drummer for sure.
Yeah, because I didn't even know they had stuff like that. I've always sequenced everything by hand from scratch on the drums. But then again, I'm not doing rock either. You know what I mean? So
Yeah. So I mean, most of the time, like, I can hear in my head what I would want to happen. But
yeah,
the problem is that, like, I get so bored sequencing drums that I'm looking for shortcuts so I can get back to the song. And so if I'm in a band, then it's not a big deal because the drummer and I can just sit and work it out, and we figure out our parts. And, oh, why don't we do this very cool thing here or whatever. But when you're doing it all yourself, like the bass line stuff, I love doing that. I love writing bass lines and pulling out the bass and composing a part for that, and that's something that I'm very passionate about. But when it comes to drums are so important. I have the love of them, and I love a great drummer really makes a song. But when it comes to me being that person, that's where I'm looking for some tricks to make it happen. And
yeah.
it gets easier if in the song creation part, like, you're just jamming with a drum beat or something. Like, you can pull up Easy Drummer and sift through a few things and adjust the tempo, and then I've got the main part of the song, the drums for the main part of the song, and then it's a matter of finding a few different parts or editing those parts, or even it has some, like,
Do, do,
elements that help you fill out a song.
do you take inspiration from any other stuff? Like, because sometimes that's what I'll do. Like, if I'm on a real like '90s techno kick or trance
Hmm.
kick, like I'll listen to like a bunch of tracks from that era, some of the popular ones, some stuff that's maybe a little more obscure, and that'll help sometimes influence like how I design that portion of the song. Because, like you said, like the percussion is extremely important, but it can also really influence the overall style of the whole thing too. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I
So,
think our influences really come into it deeply, and the music that I started growing up, or I started out playing and listening to when I got a guitar, was a lot of classic rock and a little bit of metal, and then I expanded out into blues also. And so with those genres, I mean, they definitely build from the previous generation. So if you think about it, I mean, you had these guys, these 1930s or whatever, 20s, 30s or whatever, like African American bluesmen, the originals, the Robert Johnson and the like. And then you have another generation that's like, we're getting into the 50s and the 60s and the 70s with, like, Albert King and Muddy Waters and BB King and guys like that. And then those guys are influencing all the British rockers or early rockers, and they're doing their own kind of bluesy rock thing, and it's turning into hard rock and metal and that kind of stuff. And so it just keeps building. In fact, I mean, it's a well-known thing, like Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin was not just inspired, but they heavily ripped off a lot of the old blues. And but I just went down a rabbit hole on that. Oh yeah, yeah. We're talking, like, listening to tracks. I'm like,
yeah,
so yeah,
like when you're running into issues, or if I'm just curious, do you
oh,
take, for, if you're struggling with a portion of a song, do you go back and reference anything, or do you sit down starting with like, I really like
yeah.
that drum fill in this Phil Collins
Mhm.
track. Let me let me see if I can emulate that.
I don't think for me, I don't do it when I have a problem. I think I'd go about it other ways. But I think in the beginning parts of writing a song, so, well, I guess to back up a little bit, like, so, I mean, where does it begin for me? For most of my time as a musician, it always started with the guitar. And so playing, finding a great tone, maybe, as you say, you've been listening to something, you're like, I kind of want to go in that direction or that genre. And I've always enjoyed, because I've had to do songwriting stuff with other people that was a little more, you got to get it done in a hurry, and I always hated it because it felt very fake. And like for writing pop songs and country songs and stuff like that, they have so often there's little groups of people and producers that meet and they'll just whip them out. But a lot of the time for me, it just feels very inauthentic, and especially lyrically when you get to some of that stuff. Like, I mean, gosh, Van Halen's one of my favorite bands, but lyrically they're absolutely crap. That's always really bothered me. So finding an influence, being connected to my influences has always been really important. And one of the things that I've always enjoyed doing is I felt like if I could get the feel of these musicians, not necessarily note for note, because there was a lot of that when I was starting guitars. Like, I got to learn how this solo is played and kind of dissect it and figure out what's going on. But what people usually miss is the feel of things. How to play something in the style of Brian May that's not the exact licks that he used. And so that, to me, that kind of thing was important. So to me, like the kind of shits and giggles of songwriting is like, what if this happened? And so one of my more recent tracks was just that kind of inspiration. And so to me, the idea was coming to it was like, okay, I had just been sitting down and playing a little something. I don't remember if it was the keyboard or the guitar that it started on, but I was like, I sat down to write a song, and I was like thinking, man, okay, so Pink Floyd hires Vangelis and does a spaghetti western, and what would that sound like? And so there's like these kind of different elements that like haven't gone together before. Like, what would this sound like? In fact, I listened to something interesting today. It just came up on my feed, and there's this guy. I don't remember where he's from. Might be like Scandinavian or something. But he did this these really funny videos where he would take news items, like, a Karen getting like really upset about something and yelling and having a basically adult temper tantrum, and he would put it to like metal music or like some of those like what was that
oh, I think I know the guy you're talking about. Like, he'll play according
long hair.
Is that what you're talking
like
about? Yeah,
so
yeah.
one of them was like one of the TV preachers, the scam artist guys, and he like COVID, we're gonna all the weird extremist stuff that all the rest of the Christians would be like really embarrassed that guy's doing, and he made it like metal. And, but he did one that was like Master of Puppets by Metallica, but in the style of Muse, and guitar, bass, singing all the parts of that, and it's pretty hilarious. But also, there's a bit of talent in that. The thing is, like, I think people can sometimes get stuck in those ruts of their favorite artists, and everything they write, it's got to sound like one or two bands, But I kind of enjoy it.
For you personally, though, I mean, do you, when you're writing, do you do stuff like that? Are you trying to mishmash a bunch of stuff together like that?
Oh, well, just not regularly, no. Like that song that I did, it was just like, man, I love Pink Floyd, and so I wanted to, I've written other songs that are kind of Pink Floyd-ish, but that's something that I like to return to, and that's just for my own enjoyment. But when I'm writing, I mean, it does end up being kind of a mishmash of influences, and then the things that I prefer, the chords that I like, and I don't want to sit and just go, I'm going to do this kind of thing and do it. I kind of prefer to have the very first moment of the songwriting being somewhat coming out of the air, I guess, like where you're sitting and you're playing and you're enjoying what you're playing, and then all of a sudden your fingers stumble across something, and it's chords and melodies and everything that you've already played before, and you know all that stuff, but it comes into a sequence and your mind is kind of working it out. And sometimes, I'll just sit and I'll just keep working and like, yeah, that's good, and I start experimenting, like, so I've got a couple chord progression, and like, what's that third chord or that fourth chord, and I'll just keep sitting and working it out until I find, okay, well, that's got to be somewhere in the neighborhood of whatever, F sharp minor, but maybe what if we added a ninth to that, or something else, and just keep experimenting with the voicing so I find something that's interesting and that's going to work. And to me, like the chordal part of it is probably the place that's the home base for me. So I don't start with the drums or the bass. To me, it's like the rhythm, whether that's rhythm guitar or it's a keyboard part. That's kind of where I start. Like, and
I was going to ask, when you're starting from scratch, are you more apt to pick up the guitar and start noodling with that, or are you cool sitting down with the keys first of all?
Yeah, so I mean, these days it's pretty mixed. I'm definitely more comfortable on the guitar because I can make it do immediately everything that I want it to do. Whereas the keyboards, I can write parts. One of the problems that I've had is that I can write parts that are more complex than what I can play. And so usually when it's starting to get to that point, like, there's a little bit of like, okay, I've got to practice this so that I can actually be able to do what my mind is hearing. I know what this chord is and this changes and this thing, but now I've got to make it work. And so, I can practice that out and get it. So, I mean, these days, again, with my YouTube stuff, it's kind of random music. It's really experimental as far as I want to try different genres, and like, oh, what if I do, Dominic Hawken was telling me one time, he was talking about dub reggae. I was like, well, what's dub? I mean, I know what reggae is. I understand that. But it's like, well, it's just kind of remixed reggae with lots of reverb and stuff. And I started listening. He sent me over a YouTube mix of it. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is cool. I really like this. And so one of my goals was like, why don't I do something that's in that style? And so then I would work. And so the song became a tool to work on it stylistically and also to get whatever chops I needed instrumentally up to the task of doing that. But I think like what my preference would probably always be guitar. And I find I don't know how to describe this, but so we've talked in the past about like, how do you learn, what is your go-to for functioning, like, because there's a lot of like drummers that are audio or kinesthetic and very much in the physicality of it, which makes sense. Like rappers oftentimes have that very kinesthetic, it's like the beat that's there, it's that rhythm, it's that thing and it's aggressive. And other, ambient musicians are probably on the full other side of the spectrum and a lot more visual. And so when I think about writing and sitting down and writing, I know some music theory, so I use that, and it's part of the process, but I don't really like starting from that point. These are all the chords I can work with in this key, or here's some modulation, and he's like, no, it's not really that's not fun to me. That's more, I don't have a problem going between artist and technician, but to me that's starting with the technical part of it or the technician part of it, and I don't want to do that. I want to start the process, got to start with the art and as an artist. And so yeah, I guess I like to go that way. And between the guitar and the keyboard, it is a different feel. I like visually I gravitate to the guitar, and I see the way that it works visually much easier than I do with the piano. In fact, like so I've heard a lot of pianists talk about and keyboard players talk about how hard the guitar is and like what's different. And then, I think actually last week I think Tim had talked about this, the tuning of a guitar and why it's so funky and like like, well, you're doing good for four strings and you get to the B string here and then it's a different interval and then you're back to the other interval for the high E, that kind of thing. And like, but for some reason that works with my brain. And when I'm sitting and I'm working on the keyboard and I'm going through stuff, I hit a lot more wrong notes because it's the geometry of it is not quite as intuitive to me as the guitar. So I guess but I do spend time writing for both because sometimes, I mean, you're working on something and you find a good sound, like a great synth sound, and doing some sound design or something like, oh, I could do something with this. And I'll sit and I'll work it on the keyboard and it ends up coming out sounding totally different than anything I'd write on guitar, which I like,
Yeah.
But I guess for the process, I mean, it used to be. I mean, I didn't spend a lot of time in front of a DAW before because I was playing a lot live or with bands, and I would, I could write with a band, and that's one process. But writing at home was always just kind of, finding that what's the word I'm looking for? It's like that random inspiration that comes upon you, and you as you come across things, and one of the things I liked about the guitar is that because of its nature, you can do things and move it around in patterns and come across things without while staying in the artist mode and not having to be the technician. And so, you might be playing something that you're not going to really hear this, but you might be playing something in an open position, then sliding it around, and you're like, oh, that sounds great. And without thinking, what is that chord? You're just playing a chord and it sounds nice. And later, as you're recording it and you're playing the bass line and the keyboards and stuff, you got to figure it out. You go, oh, okay, well, this is a, whatever, and working on it. But I've always kind of enjoyed that would be serendipity, I guess, like of finding different things and moving the shapes around. And yeah, I mean, okay, well, there's a ninth chord, or, to not have to involve the brain in that way in that beginning process. And so it used to be that I would just sit and play the guitar and I would write songs and then I would write lyrics and stuff. But these days, I mean, this little area, which is my computer, the studio monitors, and I've got a synthesizer here and a synthesizer here. And that's like this is my little cubby for writing music. And so usually these days, how it starts for me is I'll pull up Logic and I have a template that just gets me going, and it has the basic stuff like I'm always have some Valhalla reverb on Ascend, and certain things set up like amp modeling. Couple of my favorite amp modelers, so I'll have maybe a dozen tracks that have some inputs from physical instruments coming into my interface, and some for guitar and bass and that kind of setup. And I can just sit here and switch between instruments and begin a song and start working on something. Or if I'm doing some sound design and something comes out and I'm like, oh, I really like the way that sound, then maybe I'll stop doing the sound design and use that particular sound and see what I could do with it.
Cool. Tim.
Dude.
Spill the beans, man. I want to know how you do your stuff. So I can copy you.
I don't think you want to copy this.
No, you got a really cool style, man. I'm curious, especially for you. I've only seen you work pretty much on that rig that you have there. Is that is that kind of the extent of your flow? Is just starting on that?
No, that's been like the last couple of years, basically.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, where I've sort of developed that whole rig, and I'm just trying to make that its own little beast back there. But I do, right underneath me, I have just a MIDI controller keyboard, and so a lot of times I'm just playing piano things, or piano and some organ, or something way more organic. But that rig has just been for me to explore that side of me, which I hadn't done before. That was an entire like creation process, and even coming up with that rig and how it works. But for me, so it's not just limited to that, but definitely, I number one, I have to have motivation. What's my motivation in writing? What am I doing? What am I hearing? Normally that means maybe I heard something on the radio, or maybe I'm just kind of vibing something in my head, and that's my motivation. Is it a film sounding thing? No. That kind of go through this process. Is it something really rocking? Yeah, maybe so. And a lot of times that decision is made from whatever I haven't done in a minute, and I might be needing the freshness of just uh, picking something kind of mid tempo or something, or
Mm.
like find a vibe. What's my motivation? That atmosphere is kind of everything. Now I know, all right, that could start with like a drum groove then, or that could start with maybe just like some kind of rhythmic thing that I come up with, I don't know, on the synth or something. Um, or it could start with a sequence. But at least I know in my head kind of what my first couple of moves are. And then I think, like you, Marshall, I kind of start massaging things and goofing with things until something kind of happens. I can usually make something happen fairly quick, but also it can be a pitfall because it can be kind of idiosyncratic of what I do, and so that editor will pop in sometimes too soon.
Mm.
But I do like to try to keep what I'm doing fresh. That's important to me more than anything else. Is just to I care what other people think about my music. I want them to like it, but what I have to do is like I have to be happy with where it's going, and there's got to be something really interesting about it to me first. So then, yeah, Pro Tools gets opened up for recording, usually only lately, just because I wanted to explore, yeah, this whole world and what I could do with it, just by hardware, and just learning that, and then getting sort of a vibe for that down, and just doing jams is kind of what I've done before with that, is mostly for jamming, but it depends on my motivation. I have an acoustic guitar over here. I can play about 6 chords on it. It's all at the end of the neck, cowboy chords. But it's great because in Nashville, that also allows me to sit down with other guys who like to write on guitar, and I can at least be somewhat present in making a contribution quarterly, as well as
Mm.
melody and words and lyrics. So I've written a number of songs just on guitar. I mean, they're nothing crazy, and in the hands of a real great player or something, they can become something more than they are. But I get different results if
Yeah.
I just sit at the piano and plunk something out, or if I grab the guitar and try to, and just try to figure something out or get that vibe, or if I come over here to my synth rig and start making something a little more ambient or colorful, and less, maybe even less specific about chord changes right away, then I get 3 different results. So motivation for me is I got to know what I'm up to. I can just start messing around until something happens, but I do way better to know what my motivation is for sure. And then, yeah, then it might be chord changes, or it could be a drum groove.
I'm just
Um,
curious, real quick, Tim.
yeah, man.
For your process, then, when you say you look for that motivation, is it just an emotional state, or is I guess I'm curious a little more about how, like, where that motivation is coming from for you most of the time.
It is an emotional state. It's something I know that, like today, I might not be vibing on, writing something really pumping and heavy or something. This day, that's not what I'm feeling. So I already know I kind of want to do something a little chill or whatever like that. It's definitely, yeah, it's an internal temperature
Cool. Yeah.
for,
I'm
for
the
where I
same
want
way.
to go.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah, I would say it's an emotional thing, definitely. Or it could be coming from inspiration that I heard something that I was like, God, what would that's so cool. Like, I got to get some of that in me, like what does it sound like when I try something like that? How's that come
Yeah.
out? And but that's still my motivation is like the inspiration from that helpful. Um, but yeah, then building up the song is a fun process, and I'm constantly I usually go too far. I'll put it this way, but I kind of do that on purpose. I'll usually go too far and kind of sit back and then let that editor dude come in for a second because I try to keep him out for a long time. But I'll be damned if sometimes he gets in there anyway, right? But I'm like, hang on a second, you're gonna have your moment. And so I try to, and I'll just start throwing a lot of stuff at the wall, and then it's almost like a subtractive process. I'll go back and start removing things. What doesn't have to be there that I was just trying to see where it would take me, but now that I listen, that's really superfluous, and it's just kind
Yeah.
of cluttering the track. So then sometimes I'll go back and pull stuff out and go and listen to two things just against each other that I hadn't heard yet like that. Like those two things came later in between some other parts that I had put in there. And those were working. And then I'm like, yeah, but what if I remove those? And then these parts I just never heard against each other. What does that give me? So that's a fun process for me, especially with the synth rig, is to find something really kind of stark or like really just saying it. And it's without there being a whole lot of stuff. Now, that being said, my stuff can get pretty dense too. So it can get pretty thick with textures and whatnot, just because it's fun.
Yeah.
Because it's fun to do. But yeah, I've got on my YouTube channel, I've got things that are just instrumental and that are just like piano and a little bit of strings or something, and then I'm wanting it to be this cinematic fluidity. So it kind of depends, but I typically use Machine. That's my favorite way to get a drum track going. I love the sounds that are available, and it just does a whole lot. And I've learned kind of how to manipulate it live. You could really play the thing live pretty great.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not at that skill level yet. I can do some things, and the things I've sort of learned I use.
Now
But
is machine so like I use an Ableton push and it works really well with Ableton and but machine like I don't really understand how that works. Do you use that with Pro Tools then, or how is that? Or it's like
I
its
have,
own like almost
yeah.
like an MPC kind of thing. Like
The way that I'm using it now, and the way that I want to learn better how to use it, is just to use the patterns. It's kind of drum machiney in that way, like patterns, and then scenes. It has scenes, and so like launching the scenes is, I guess, would be the analogy to push.
right, but
Um,
it's all internal or
mhm.
is it
Yeah,
more,
it's all internal.
okay.
It is. I mean, it could be sending program changes. I could be doing a lot of different things with it that I'm not utilizing yet. And I tend to just use it for drums and maybe something that's just kind of odd that's like helping the track along in a way.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, you can just do it and play it live in sections. So in that case, I have pre-programmed sections, and then I'm just sort of choosing between them.
Like
Now, are you?
sequences that you put in to machine
Yeah,
that
yeah,
you
like
program in?
yeah, different scenes that are in there,
Okay.
made up of
Yeah.
patterns and whatnot. And then you can sit there and mute pads live, and you can kind of do a build up and a breakdown um, that way, and
Yeah, it's
do a
interesting.
drop. Yeah,
So
I want to get really better at that, but I kind of just spend a lot of time trying to get to know these synths. So that's
yeah.
that's
Well,
been the thing. But but
Take the rest of your life, probably. Yeah.
and then also for the writing process for me now let's say I've gotten some things done out of one of those starting points, and I've got a song kind of cooking. It now might become, a vocal song. It might become something with lyrics, because a lot of times I might not start there. But I do usually know, okay, I'm going to write some kind of vocal thing, or I hear like a hook line in my head, and then come down and try to find something. Okay, what's the flavor here? What's that going to fit over? So that again is part of my process, is just knowing, is this going to be an instrumental most likely, or is this going to be a vocal tune or tune with lyrics most likely? And that's helpful in getting things done. Then let's see, I've carved out some stuff. Let's say it's starting to feel like a tune. Arrangements really probably the next thing I would do is to find not really not a trick so much, but something that's a little bit of a like, oh, well, that's interesting. I will consciously look for that and try to make that happen. I think that's a good way to spice things up a little, because you can tend to just let it be the thing that it is. But I like to go back and kind of find a moment where's that kind of sagging, or anything of that nature. Like, what could I do to make it just a little more cool? Maybe the chorus is down instead of up, or maybe, maybe you just kind of flip everything on its ear for a second and see what it does. Just because I'm always just looking for interesting results, but that would be like arrangement wise, kind of would be the next step. And then depending on if I've written lyrics and I'm doing a vocal or not. And then, yeah, now, well, I've done it two ways. I've done it where I'm committing some of that audio as I go along, or I'm waiting until the last second. In the jams, it's nothing's in the DAW, so it is all going down the last second. It's all going down to its own track, and it's going through, and then it's just go back and mix. That's, I guess, kind of my process in a nutshell. But for me, it's, the motivation thing's important, and just knowing what it is I'm trying to do is really helpful, because there are a lot of ways to go, right, Jids?
Oh yeah. I'm curious about your guys' amount of time from start to finish on average, if you have one.
Yeah, I will. If it's just guitar, like if it's an acoustic guitar track, like maybe just acoustic guitar and singing, that can get done pretty fast. Probably the lyric writing for it and the melody would take the longest for me. So, I mean, some of those things can come out in under an hour, and then other times, I mean, most of the time, because I'm using the DAW as part of the part of the songwriting process, it gets stretched out quite a bit more. So, yeah, I can imagine whatever 20 hours or something being probably a pretty realistic thing for writing and recording, to put something out on YouTube. Seems like that. And then, I think if I were a little more disciplined at this point as far as recording and mixing, the mixing part of it, because I get through that pretty quick. But again, it's just because I kind of been on, again, fighting myself, because I think I normally would rather see something through and work on it and refine it and keep refining it and keep refining it. And my attitude for growth right now has been just do a lot of stuff and you'll refine as you're trying out all these new things. And so that's kind of been pushing me to try to get things done a lot quicker, and to pull them out of time just so that I can work on more projects.
What about you, Tim?
I guess it depends on what I'm doing. If I'm just sitting down and writing a song on guitar that's a lyric song that's just a vocal tune, I feel like writing a tune like that could happen in an hour or 2 hours. But like for the synth jams I've done for the past couple years, wow, those take a minute. And also because there's the recording part of it, and then there's the video element too. But I guess just to say that from the moment I hit record, so basically it's the music is finished and I'm now just archiving it, then that's usually a 2 day process for me. So probably, yeah, I don't, 13 hours or something, 14 hours maybe, just because that's on average, just because it's just a time consuming thing. And I'm trying to find something unique. And that necessarily means you may scrap some things or spend extra time sound design or something of that nature. Or also, I try to learn something about my gear as I'm going along.
Mm-hmm.
I try to sit down and say, "Man, I've never used this aspect of this synth.
Yeah.
I'm gonna just make sure I do that in this song, so that I get a song out of it, and I've also learned something." Yeah.
Yeah, I do that a lot too, and with even with plugins and mixing, it's like I need to learn this skill or learn how to do that with this thing here. So let's make something around that process. How about you,
Absolutely.
Marshall?
Um, what was the question again? Sorry.
The question that you asked.
Well,
How about
you guys had already kind of asked me about that, right? So it takes me about 20, 30 hours on average from start to finish.
yeah.
I don't start with really anything in mind, and so it takes a long time most of the time to get through the whole
Mm-hmm.
process. And I don't use. I do kind of my sound design on the fly as I'm
Mhm.
writing. So
Mhm.
all that
Yeah.
stuff. I have a feeling like if I was a paid professional working on film or TV or games or something, you got deadlines you got to meet, you got to do XYZ. I think I would have a lot more structure involved, and I could probably cut the time down for some of this stuff. But
Right.
since I'm doing this for me and for fun,
Right.
I don't mind taking the extra time needed
Yeah.
to kind of come up with stuff on the fly and not rely on a core set of elements.
Yeah. At some point, you're going to compromise under that situation. You're going to
Yeah.
say, "That's good enough," and you're going to
Yep.
settle instead of being able to take that time. Yep, to push yourself a little bit further.
Yeah. And gear wise, like this, you can spend an eternity on a single piece of equipment. I remember spending hours and hours and hours uh, learning the different instruments in Reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still sure there's plenty of stuff I could do in there that I never even thought of. And it's the same with all this stuff, and it's cool. But yeah, at the end of the day, most of this stuff, I have most of the gear in here because one, I wanted it, of course, but because also there's certain things that you can do with one instrument that you can't necessarily do with the other, or do it as well or as easily. So they have their certain places, but I don't necessarily dissect the instruments entirely. I mean, it would take forever,
Yeah.
you know.
What about as far as well? I'd have two questions about order of things. First of all, probably the easier one. Are you working on multiple songs at once, or are you going in more of a linear order? Like, I'm going to work on this song until I'm done, and then it's done, and I start the next one? Or you got like, you're saving up ideas. You're like, oh, maybe one week you come up with four different song ideas and you jot them down in your DAW or something, and then you kind of circle back to them, or you lose a little bit of inspiration and you leave it alone for a while and come back to it. How does that work for you guys? What kind of track do you take?
I can field that one first if it,
Sure.
Yeah,
Marshall
go
is
for it.
one. Definitely, there's a moment, and I know when it is, and that it feels like you've hit a brick wall, and that's when it's time to stop, uh, or do something else. Go take a walk, and maybe come back. But I usually when I made this solo record. It's about God. It's probably 4 years old now. Weird. Whoa. Where I wanted to write all the songs, I wanted to sing all the songs, and I wanted to play most of the instruments. So I did. It took me a while to do, but it's out there. It's called Heartfelt Absurdities. And during that process, I thought the best way to go about it, having never done this before, by the way, was to kind of work on songs. And then when I got tired of one, I would just close it and go up and open up another one and see how that would go. And not, I was afraid it was going to put me in a rut to just work on one song over and over again. But what I learned about myself is that to bop around like that, it takes forever to finish anything. And while it may have been a good feeling thing to me in that moment to step away from one thing that I was kind of having to pound out and I could move to something else, I learned that when I do that, it just really waters down the productivity for me. So what I figured out was, as tempting as it is to open another song up and see what you could do on it, unless you're really just feeling that inspiration, I have to personally stick with what I'm on and just see it out. It'd be better for me to walk away and take a walk, or whatever, and then come back to it because I'm still in that zone. If that makes sense to you guys, that's what I learned about myself.
Yeah, I'm pretty similar. I if I step away from a project for too long, it's extremely difficult to come back to it, and it's likely that it will probably never get finished. So I tend to, if I start working on something, I try and finish it before I move on to something else if I can. But there are times where, you're just not feeling it or whatever, and I have come back and finished stuff like that. But like Tim says, for me, it really can put a drag on it. But there are times where, we've been doing this a long time. You'll have a bunch of unfinished stuff from years ago.
Right.
And it is fun sometimes to go back and pull stuff, maybe not the whole song, but parts of a song or parts of a track that you were working on years ago. And in fact, the collaboration track we did, the percussion that's in that is from something I wrote 14 years ago. So they can still have value. But yeah, like for me, it's the same thing. Like if I'm working on something, I try and finish it, and not work on a bunch of different stuff at the same time.
Yeah, for me, I would say I jump around a little bit more, and so I guess I want to catch. I mean, yeah, it's a hard thing. So I think it was. Oh gosh, I don't even remember who had asked him, but I think somebody had asked John Lennon, what are some of your tips for songwriting? He's like, if you get the inspiration, finish the song, like try to work on until you get it done. And obviously that really worked for him. And if you can sit and write a song on the acoustic guitar or piano, then I think that's probably a good strategy. And I think there's something to that. However, I think with kind of making the music that I've been making, and I don't think that works as often. So a lot of the tracks I do, I'll just start and kind of have a few little things that I'll record for later and come back to, but try to keep it to one track. But I have been making a habit of revisiting things to finish them up. And so there are those tracks, and again, so much of what I do right now is having fun and experimenting with things. So it's like, oh, this is a very 80s sounding track or something. I'll work on it for a while, and then I'll just get tired of listening to it. And my devotion to it wanes, and so I'll go, okay, I'll come back. And the hard part is that, like, I'll come back to it, I'll listen to it, and I'll be excited for a moment, like, oh yeah, that was a great track. And then I'll be like, no, I gotta finish it up. And that's not the fun part, really. But
that's the work.
Yeah, that's the work.
It is. That's the work part right there.
Yeah.
But I think with the discipline of it, so it's like, well, this could be something, and it's worth the effort of it. then I find it's that moment of coming back to it. Like I might for 2 days have to struggle with it and go like, okay, what am I going to do next? I don't. What was I doing here? What? No, just kind of go with it and just sit with it and start working stuff out again. And sometimes it's been a really helpful tool to take a song that was maybe just not quite right and you weren't finding that part, and the next time you attack it, it's with a different guitar or different synth, and all of a sudden that inspiration strikes again, and you delete some of it and you rework it, and then all of a sudden, like, okay, yeah, that was the thing that was really needed to become, and it wasn't going to happen before. I'm always kind of mystified, hearing bands that like wrote songs years before they're released, and it's kind of a nice age that we're in, that when you buy some of these albums, they'll do the oh, it's the 20th anniversary reissue or whatever. Also, we're also going to add a bunch of we'll add 10 outtakes or different versions, or the songwriting early on, the first acoustic demo they did of it or whatever, and you hear where the song's starting, and that they stopped working on it for a while, but then like 3 years later, all of a sudden they introduced it to the band again and got some fresh creativity and finished it out.
And that's cool. But even better than that is nowadays, we have the ability to pretty much back up everything 100%. So you can come back to something even years later. Although you will probably run into issues where you might have that one plugin that you don't have anymore, doesn't work on your new operating system, stuff like that. That can be a whole topic even. I mean, gosh, like going back from Windows XP days and some of the stuff there, and trying to pull up something that's almost 20 years old on a modern machine. You probably need to have an old XP system laying around somewhere, but it's a lot better to archive nowadays than back in those days. You know what I mean? And I find it fascinating, just like you do, Chris. Like hearing tracks from famous people that started and how they started and how they ended.
Yeah.
That process from an early mix, an early rough cut or something, or some ideas that kind of morphed into something else. That part's really cool to hear. And especially when it's a really popular song that and everybody knows.
Yeah.
That's just crazy how they started here. That would have been no good. You know what I mean? But they ended up with gold at the end. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and to see the twists and turns it takes, and also sometimes the shock is how many versions of it they did and how many takes they did, and it's like, well, here's Strawberry Fields Forever take 43, and here's take 67, and like, oh my gosh, do you just want to kill yourself because you've heard that song so many times, but they persevered and made one of the most epic songs ever.
Yeah, that's too much. Because I mean, you are beating the life out of it at that point, just trying to get a take. Now, for those guys, brilliant as they are or were, the Beatles, that is, but they also, weren't all that proficient at getting takes fast. No, obviously, but they were also experimenting a whole lot, so they're not speeding it. But if you were playing the same thing over and over and take 67, as a drummer, if I don't get it in, it's usually 2 or 3. That's usually where the magic is. Because other than that, I start breaking it down in my head. I can't help it. I start repeating myself and refining it, and doing the same stuff, and then I kind of narrow it down. And now I just start playing almost the same drum track. Like it's just going to be this over and over again. Yeah. But that 2 and 3 leaves a little bit of magic and a little bit of like, you just slid under the finish line kind of thing. And it has more excitement that way. It starts really seeming contrived.
Yeah, the performance part of it. If you're playing an instrument live there's that balance, because some of the early takes on it will be a lot more raw and a little bit more slippery, but they might have the emotion that you need to convey it, and sometimes a decision is like you just got to go with it because, just as you said, it can become so mechanical afterwards, and you lose the vibe of it.
Yeah, you lose the magic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think for the example that I was just using with the Beatles, I mean, I don't know, I don't remember how many takes of Strawberry Fields. They worked on that for a while,
Yeah.
but I think it was more mainly like redoing arrangement stuff. I mean, they did their first album in a day, I think. Please, Please Me. But then, when they had all the time to be creative, it was more like, what if we reworked it? And then, months later, they'd come back and like kind of randomly for a day work on a song, like kind of an
Well,
odd thing, but it worked
that's
for
really
them.
kind of how Marshall was describing, and you too, and me too, about how, we just get started with an idea, and then the writing process comes along at the same time as you're doing sound design, so
Mhm.
you're choosing instruments, and like in a band setting, you're still experimenting with, no, maybe it needs to be a whirly through a Leslie or something. And, you're just still, that's all part of the same process. And then that leads you down another road. So you're right. That's definitely what they were up to.
Mhm. Well, how are we doing for time, guys?
That's probably about that time.
Yeah.
About that time.
Break forth the rhythm and the rhyme. Don't worry, I'll never do that again.
I want you to bring back the Marky Mark of last week, though.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's funny because I've been on the '90s kick for a while, and I will go through and peruse like some old '90s music videos, and that was one that I had watched recently. So,
That's amazing.
last week, it was the same, and that was the first thing that popped in my head because I had just watched that old music video.
The
Perfect.
90s are very underappreciated for music.
Well, some of it is pretty awful, but some of it's really good too, and you forget. I remember having a talk with my old man a while back, and I was like, did anything good come out of the 90s? Like, I can't remember a single thing. And then you start thinking about it, and you're like, actually, no, there was
was a
actually
lot.
some cool stuff. Well, because you
Oh,
think about
yeah.
the 80s had really great music in a lot of different ways. A lot of good electronic music, a lot of good rock music,
Mhm.
some really awesome movies. And then so like for a while I'd kind of forgot that the 90s did have some cool stuff.
Some great music. At least grunge for me was just such a
Yeah, grunge.
breath
Yep.
of fresh air to hear some people really, getting some stanky rock and roll thing happening again, but with that little bit of psychedelia in there. I love it.
Yeah.
Man, that was like that. In 1991 was like one of the most epic years of music because you had so many, like 6 months, and you had so many great albums that were coming out that were straddling hard rock, grunge, and metal. And so it's like, you know,
Mm.
Pearl Jam 10, Nevermind, the Black Album,
Mhm.
on and Use Your Illusion, I think. All these like really epic, at least rock albums, were coming out at that time. And a few years later, there was a lot of really good ones too. But I
Yeah.
don't know. But go ahead.
I agree though. That grunge was a big thing for me. I was in my teens in the mid to late 90s. So,
Oh, that's perfect.
yeah, so I loved all that stuff. I thought it was cool.
Yeah.
I dressed like shit, had, flannels with jeans with holes in them. My parents thought I was on drugs, even though I wasn't.
No, I wasn't.
Yeah.
Well, gents, it's been a fun show. I guess we're going to wrap it up, eh?
Pleasure. Yeah.
Um, always great to talk with you guys and send stuff around the horn, as I said earlier, and it's fascinating actually. And I just love hearing about both of your processes, and it helps me with mine. I hope it helps some of our, some of the people watching, to maybe get some inspiration or some thoughts, or just even a bit of knowledge. That's definitely why this channel exists.
Yeah, and if you're watching this on the replay, leave some comments on some of your processes and techniques. It'd be cool to hear from you. And we've had some folks in the live chat here giving us some feedback as well. So this has been
Absolutely.
fun times. Yeah.
It always fascinates me to see how everybody is so different, and that's, we talked about it last week. Like, being that so many of our friends make music, and we would have never known each other in person because we live so far away from one another, and that's, even with the three of us, we're on. I mean, you guys are a lot closer than I am to you, but even so, like, you never would have like ran into each other at the grocery store.
Right.
So
Right.
this to talk with people all over the world about, how are you making music and what are you doing and some of the interesting things that are coming out. It's really a great thing. In fact, as a segue, well, that worked out well. Making music with people all over the world. We happened to do that a couple of months ago, and the three of us and Jamie Morden of Geosense did a track. And so this coming Wednesday, we will have a discussion about collaborations, because it can be one of the most awesomely epic things ever, or it can just go down in a burning pile of, yeah.
A compost heap on fire.
Yeah.
So bring your stories to the chat, and
Yeah. Good or bad. Yeah.
in fact, also just as a reminder, like, we set up a Facebook group. If you're busy and you've got other Facebook groups that you're in, like, don't make less music to come and be in part of our Facebook group, because don't do that, like, make music instead. But if you got the time and you'd like to talk about how to make music and the kind of stuff, kind of topics that we've been talking about, and gear as well. And we haven't talked about gear too much yet, but in the future we'll get to more of those topics as well. But the main thing is that we got to be productive and we got to be creating art. And so we'll be having more conversations. We just have really got it going. So you can find Thru Port Collective. There's a page set up, which I'm sure we'll eventually start posting to. But really the more important thing would be the group. So come join us, and maybe we can have some conversations about collaborations this week and there, because we'd love to hear some stories, and maybe we can share some of those next Wednesday as well.
Absolutely.
Sounds good.
All right. Anything else that we need to do, guys? Is that it?
That's it.
I think that's us.
Thanks for tuning in,
All right.
everybody.
Thanks for checking it out. We're a show. It's done.
See you next week. Same bat
Thanks.
time, same bat channel.